The sound of a screen door snapping shut behind you. That sharp metallic spring pulling it back into place. You heard it a dozen times a day and never once thought about it. This was Mississippi in 1962. The wide, flat Delta country, where the land stretched so level you could watch a thunderstorm rolling in from 20 miles away. The whole state held just over 2 million people then, roughly the same as New Mexico today, but spread across a land where every single life was woven tight against the next. The smell of biscuits baking at 5 in the morning, butter melting across a hot cast iron pan. That smell told you the day had started before your eyes were even open. This is the story of an ordinary day in Mississippi in 1962. A day nobody wrote down because nobody thought it was worth writing. But only those who lived it know exactly what it looked like. Let's start with the morning. Because in Mississippi that year, the morning started earlier than you might think and lasted longer than anywhere else. The man of the house was up at 5. No alarm needed. Nothing woke you more reliably than the cold, bare wood floor under your feet on an October morning. Breakfast in Mississippi in the 1960s was not something you grabbed on the way out the door. It was something you sat down for, together, before the day pulled you away. Grits cooked from the night before. Biscuits made with real butter and real buttermilk. Fatback fried down in cast iron. This was a working man's breakfast before a long day in the fields. The radio on the windowsill pulled in AM from a Memphis station, and if you aimed the antenna just right, you could sometimes catch New Orleans on a morning with a south wind. The Clarion Ledger landed at the end of the drive around 6, and the man of the house would pick it up, fold it into quarters, and tuck it in his back pocket to read at noon. The farmhouses in rural Mississippi then were almost always wood frame, single story, tin roofs that knocked and pinged in the rain, wooden floors that talked back under every step. Every house had a front porch, and the front porch was not decoration. It was where you spent every evening, where neighbors stopped to talk when they passed by on the road. Do you remember the feeling of a Monday morning when the whole neighborhood was moving at the same rhythm? Every house lit, every chimney smoking, every dog doing its job. The man left before 6:30, walking or driving a pickup to the gathering point where the men working the same farm climbed into the truck bed together every single morning. The women who stayed home started their day clearing the table, heating water for the wash, and setting themselves up for a long day that held 3 or 4 different kinds of work all at once. By 7 in the morning, the town was fully awake. And now, the real story begins. On Main Street, where everything that made up a day in Mississippi came together and changed hands. The most common work in the Mississippi Delta in 1962 was still cotton. From growing and picking to hauling and running the cotton gins that hummed across the region every fall. An elementary school teacher in Sunflower County that year earned around $3,500 a year. And that was considered steady work, the kind you never let go of once you had it. That year, more than 4,000 drive-in theaters were operating across the country, more than all the Starbucks locations in the entire southeastern United States today, and Mississippi alone had over 40 of them. The barbershop on Main Street was not just a place to get your hair cut. It was where you found out who just bought more land, who just sold their car, who needed extra hands for the harvest. Do you remember the bell above the door of the general store when you walked in? That small brass jingle that meant you had arrived somewhere. The owner already knew your name. The country store in rural Mississippi sold everything from seed to dress fabric to headache powder. And the owner kept a credit ledger for families he knew well, waiting until cotton season to settle up. Children in town were out of the house after breakfast, and nobody watched over them until noon. Nobody worried, nobody called to check. That was simply how summer operated. Those kids knew every trail through the pine woods, every deep spot in every creek worth jumping into. And they knew they had to be home before the streetlights came on. Summer in Mississippi, without air conditioning for most families, meant you survived the 100-degree heat by moving slow, drinking ice water, and never doing more than you absolutely had to. The standing electric fan in the corner of the living room turned slowly all summer long. It did not cool much, but its steady hum was the background sound of an entire summer, an entire childhood. Do you remember lying on the wooden floor next to that fan on a summer afternoon, pressing your cheek against the cool boards, listening to the fan like it was the ocean, and falling asleep without meaning to? Lunch at home, on days outside harvest season, was often whatever remained from supper the night before. Day-old biscuits dipped in sorghum, or cornbread crumbled into buttermilk, the kind of meal you ate without ever giving it a name. For the millions who grew up in rural Mississippi in that decade, the memory of the noon meal was not a memory of food, but a memory of the silence of a house at midday when everyone else was gone. The Baptist church was the center of every small community in the region, not just on Sunday, but Wednesday evenings, summer Bible school, any occasion that gave people a reason to gather together. The women in the ladies' auxiliary knew exactly who was sick in the neighborhood, who had just had a baby, who needed someone to bring food, and they coordinated all of it without a phone app or a group chat. The party line telephone, one wire shared among 4 to 8 households in the area, meant you waited politely for others to finish their calls, and if you were not polite about it, the whole neighborhood knew. Think about this for a moment. In 1962, the average monthly rent in rural Mississippi was around $35, less than what dinner for 2 costs at a casual restaurant in Jackson, Mississippi today. The diner on Main Street served the working lunch crowd from 11 to 1, and the cook knew exactly who sat where, who took their coffee black, who needed extra bread without being asked. By late afternoon, when the field workers came back, Main Street would start to move in a different way. Slower, more relaxed. The way a place feels when everyone is on their way home. The feed store on the corner was where farmers stopped on Friday afternoons, not always to buy anything, sometimes just to stand under the tin overhang and trade information about the coming week's weather. Do you remember the smell of a feed store? Ground corn mixed with burlap, mixed with machine oil, mixed with sawdust. A smell that had no single name, but you would know it instantly if you walked into it again today. The cotton harvest in September and October pulled the entire delta into a different rhythm, everyone working from before dawn until they could no longer see, the whole region moving as one enormous machine. The cotton gin running day and night during harvest was the defining sound of Mississippi in that decade, heard from miles away like unending low thunder. And anyone who heard it never forgot it. Children had no school during harvest in many counties, partly because families needed extra hands, partly because the teachers in the neighborhood were harvesting their own family's cotton too. The county fair in late September was the biggest event of the year for many families, bigger than Christmas itself, because it was the one day when the entire region came together in one place. The black and white television in the early 1960s in Mississippi usually pulled in 1 or 2 channels, and the whole family watched together because there was only one screen in the house, always in the living room. On Friday evenings, if the family had the money, everyone piled into the car for the drive-in, and whatever child fell asleep in the back seat before the movie ended got carried inside and laid down without waking up. The family Chevrolet or Ford was the second most important possession after the house itself, and the man of the house repaired it in the backyard every weekend because a repair shop was a luxury, not a necessity. Winter in the Mississippi Delta was not cold like the North, but cold enough that the kerosene space heater in the living room became the center of the entire house from November through March. The milk delivery man still made his rounds in some rural areas of Mississippi in the early 1960s. Glass bottles left on the doorstep before sunrise, cold and damp with condensation, a sight that would vanish before the decade was over. Ice delivery still existed in rural areas for families without electric refrigerators, and the iceman knew exactly how many pounds each household needed each week without being called ahead to ask. All of those things, the milkman, the iceman, the five and dime with its soda fountain, and the Main Street movie house, disappeared within about 15 years, faster than anyone expected at the time. The Woolworth's 5 and dime, with its soda fountain counter, where a cherry Coke cost 15 cents, and the girl behind the counter knew your name, is something anyone who grew up in that decade will describe forever. Think about this. In 1962, a Mississippi elementary school teacher worked the entire year for what today would not cover 2 months of rent in Jackson. Yet he still managed to raise a family of 4. The church bell on Sunday morning in small Mississippi towns was not something you heard passively. It was something you felt in your chest because the church was always closer than you realized. The women in the neighborhood dressed their finest on Sunday, not because anyone required it, but because it was the one day of the week when you wore the thing you had pressed, the thing you had been saving. Civic clubs like the Lions or the Rotary or the local women's clubs held monthly potluck dinners, and these were not optional. If you did not show up, the neighborhood would know and someone would come to check on you. None of those things disappeared because they were bad. The soda fountain, the party line, the milkman, the potluck dinner, the Friday drive-in, they disappeared because what replaced them arrived faster than anyone had time to notice. Do you remember the feeling of a Friday afternoon when the work week ended and the whole neighborhood seemed to exhale at once? The air itself, different, lighter, like pressure, had just been released. When people talk about summer in Mississippi in the 1960s, they usually mention the heat, but the most defining thing was not the temperature. It was the cicadas starting at 7 in the morning and not stopping until past midnight. Children learned to swim in the creek rather than a public pool, because most small Mississippi towns had no public pool, and the creek taught you to swim in ways no class could replicate. Before the day ends, stop for a moment on one detail that few people think about. In Mississippi, in 1962, the afternoon air carried no exhaust fume, no plastic smell. It carried grass and rain and ripening cotton. And now the day is turning toward evening. The stove inside is coming back to life. And the most important thing in a day in Mississippi that year is about to begin. The family supper, the thing that arrived so naturally, nobody thought it was anything special. Supper in Mississippi in the 1960s was not something you ate in front of a screen. It was something you sat down to at the table with everyone in the house. And nobody left until the last dish was cleared. Everything on the table was made by the woman of the house from the beginning. Nothing prepackaged, nothing ordered in. Every dish started as raw ingredients and ended on the table hours later. After supper, the man of the house went out to the front porch. This was not a planned habit, but something that happened as naturally as the sun setting, as the temperature dropping, as the whole neighborhood exhaling together. Neighbors would stop by the fence without being invited, just standing there talking across the gate about weather, about the harvest, about the Johnson boy who had gotten a job up in Jackson. Children played in the yard until the streetlights came on. And when the lights came on, nobody had to call them in. They already knew. It was the unwritten law that nobody broke. The television came on at 7 in the evening. The whole family in the living room together. Not each person with their own screen, but one single screen. And that meant you had to agree on what to watch. The evening habits that no longer exist. Playing rummy at the kitchen table after the TV went off. Reading aloud to children from the one storybook the family owned. Listening to the radio after the lights were out. The sense of belonging to a community was not something anyone sat down and decided to create. It arrived naturally when you knew the neighbor's dog's name, and the neighbor knew you were sick before you had a chance to say anything. By 9:30, the lights in the houses along the street went out room by room, the whole neighborhood settling into sleep at a rhythm nobody arranged but everyone followed. And that was an ordinary day in Mississippi in 1962. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth reporting, just a day that millions of people lived through and never imagined they would one day want to remember. A few things from that time still survive if you know where to look. The small Baptist churches, with hand-lettered signboards, still stand at unnamed crossroads deep in the Delta. A few small restaurants, like the old Doe's Eat place in Greenville, still open their doors, still cooking from the old recipes, and if you sit there on a Wednesday noon, you can hear stories that survive directly from that decade. And the red dirt roads of the Delta, the ones with no names and no maps, are still there, still perfectly flat and straight, taking you to cotton fields that have not changed a single thing since 1962. The last generation, with living memories of Mississippi in 1962, is now in their 70s to mid-80s. Men and women born in the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Those memories of the party line, the milkman, the sound of the screen door, the smell of biscuits at 5 in the morning, are narrowing year by year, along with the lives of the people who lived them. The smallest details are what memory holds longest. Not dates and major events, but the color of the kitchen linoleum, the smell of a screen door after rain, the feeling of cold wood floors on a winter morning. Those memories matter more than you might think. Not because that time was perfect, but because they are proof that even the most ordinary life is worth remembering, worth telling. The screen door snapping shut behind you in the morning, the smell of biscuits before the sun was up, the cicadas starting before first light. Most places do not have those things anymore, but if you close your eyes long enough, you can still hear that spring pulling the screen door shut behind you. You can still smell butter melting on a hot cast iron pan. You are still there. In the Mississippi Delta, in 1962, people lived by the rhythm of the seasons rather than the rhythm of a clock. And that difference shaped everything from mealtimes to sleeping schedules. The farmer knew September was harvest month not by looking at a calendar, but by reading the morning sky, by smelling the air before dawn, by the way the ground felt different under every step. The women at home knew the seasons their own way. November was for canning preserves. March was for planting the kitchen garden, and that knowledge passed from mother to daughter without any written instructions. Spring in Mississippi meant late afternoon thunderstorms that nobody needed a forecast to predict. You only had to watch the way the clouds gathered to the west around 3 in the afternoon to know it was coming. When the storm arrived, the whole family sat on the front porch and watched the rain come down, not running inside, not reaching for anything, just sitting and watching something you could not control, and finding peace in that. The sound of rain on a tin roof in Mississippi is something you never forget once you have heard it. Unlike rain on tile or concrete, rain on a tin roof has its own rhythm, like a great drum played from the sky. After a spring rain, the smell of the red Delta clay drinking up the water is something no words describe accurately. Only those who lived there know the exact shape that smell has inside a memory. Winter in Mississippi brought not much snow, but heavy fog. January mornings when the entire Delta was wrapped in fog as thick as cotton, and you could not see more than 30 yards in any direction. Do you remember winter mornings when your breath made small clouds in the cold air? When you had to run from the car to the door as fast as possible because the cold went through your coat faster than you expected? Christmas in a small Mississippi town that year did not arrive through a television set or a store window. It arrived with the smell of a fresh pine tree in the living room and the sound of the church choir on the evening of the 24th. 40 million Americans lived in small towns under 10,000 people in the early 1960s, more than the combined population of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota today, and their lives followed the same rhythms, whether they were in Georgia or Iowa or Mississippi. What made those small towns into real communities was not their size or location, but the simple fact that everyone knew each other's name, knew each other's story, and nobody could disappear without being noticed. The town post office was second only to the church in its importance to the community, because the mail slot was what connected you to the world beyond your county in a time before email and social media. People in small Mississippi towns that year did not talk about mental health or work-life balance. They talked about finishing the day's work, about having supper on the table, about making sure the children got enough sleep. That was not philosophy. It was life arranged in order of priority without anyone teaching the arrangement. And that order produced a kind of steadiness that is difficult to describe in today's language. You cannot take that back. You cannot recreate it by buying old furniture or painting the kitchen yellow, because it was not a material thing, but something made entirely by the way people lived alongside each other. Those watching this, who grew up in the Mississippi Delta or the small towns of the South in the 1960s, carry a kind of body memory that cannot be inherited. Only lived, the memory of rain on a tin roof, the smell of Delta earth after a storm, the screen door snapping shut. Those things do not live in your mind. They live in your body, in the way you react, before you even know why. The small town of Mississippi in 1962 was not perfect. Nobody is saying it was perfect, but it was real, and real things never completely disappear. They only change shape inside memory. And if there is anything worth carrying forward from that day, from Mississippi in 1962, it is not the objects or the customs, but the understanding that even the most ordinary day is worth living all the way through. An ordinary day in Mississippi in 1962 began with a screen door and ended with crickets, and in between was everything that makes up a life, small and complete. In Mississippi that year, people said that if you sat still long enough on the front porch in the evening, you could hear the Delta breathing. That is what the old neighbors said to each other. And they were not wrong. Monday came and Monday went. Cotton season arrived and cotton season passed. And people lived through each day, not with the expectation that life should be extraordinary, but with a quiet gratitude that it was continuing. The woman at the end of the street had been up since 5 to start the stove. Nobody called it courage or sacrifice. It was just a Monday morning in Mississippi in 1962, and the glass milk bottle was still standing on the front step, cold and beaded with moisture, waiting for the first person in the house to open the door and bring it inside. A thing so small, it was invisible until the day it was gone. The screen door will snap shut again in a few minutes, and another day in Mississippi in 1962 will begin, exactly like yesterday, exactly like tomorrow, and nobody will think anything of it. The screen door snapping shut, the smell of biscuits from the kitchen, the small radio on the windowsill, those things were once the morning of millions of people, and now live only in the memory of those watching this. The people who remember those mornings are sitting somewhere today, perhaps still in Mississippi, perhaps long since moved to Memphis or Chicago or Los Angeles, but that morning is still whole inside them. If you close your eyes right now and let memory lead, you can hear the spring of the screen door. You can smell that morning. You can feel the cold wooden floor under your bare feet. Mississippi in 1962, an ordinary day, an ordinary life. The most ordinary things are almost always the ones we miss the longest once they are no longer there. The screen door, the biscuits, the radio, the Delta, all of those things are waiting inside your own memory. You only need to sit still for a moment and let them come back. The smell of biscuits at 5 in the morning in Mississippi in 1962, the screen door, the AM radio from Memphis. Those things are no longer there, but you still know exactly what they look like. And if you ever find yourself on a red dirt road in the Mississippi Delta in the early morning, stop the car, turn off the engine, and sit still for a moment, because the Delta still remembers your name. The screen door snapping shut behind you, the biscuit smell from the kitchen, the red clay earth after rain, the cicadas at 7 in the morning. Most places do not have those things anymore, but if you close your eyes long enough, you can still hear that spring pulling the door shut behind you. You are still there, on that step, on that morning, in Mississippi, in 1962. Mississippi in 1962. If you close your eyes long enough, you can still smell that morning. You are still there.